Santa Fe, and welcome to Living Santa Fe. Today we're at the Santa Fe Community College. We've been doing shows at one of our sponsors, La Fonda, but today we're back in the studio because they finally opened it up. So we'll be in and out of the studio and La Fonda. And once again, I want to thank La Fonda for being a sponsor and for helping us out so much. Today's guests they look like twins, but they're brothers. You're younger?
Yes.
Okay.
3 years older.
3 years older. I met Don at the golf course. Jim, see, here I go. I keep thinking about the Don Burleson I went to school with. At the golf course, and I heard about this book that you wrote. And he was gracious enough to give me a copy of it. It's called The Man Who Tamed Cimarron, The Wild and Unruly Life of Pete Burleson. Now, Pete Burleson was a relative of yours. It goes back 5 generations. What? What was your connection?
He's a fifth cousin, 3 times removed. And our line comes from a John Burleson, 1704.
Okay.
And he stretches, we come down Aaron, and he goes down to a different Jonathan. But we are ultimately related to Burlesons that were Lunenburg, Virginia, came down to North Carolina. And then through change of social circumstances, crops, they eventually migrate into Texas. And then we inherit Pete because of his involvement with cattle drives.
Well, let's get a little bit into your background. Dave, what is your background? You went to New Mexico State University.
I did, and then I went to Farmington, New Mexico 1 year to serve as a police officer, and then I joined the Air Force. I was commissioned. I spent 25 years in the Air Force. I lived abroad for about 18 years. Came back to Las Cruces, New Mexico. After a short retirement, I went to go work for New Mexico State Doña Ana Community College for the next 16 years as an administrator, as a history professor, and retired as a history professor there.
You guys have law, policemen, cops in your family. You were with the police department too, weren't you?
I graduated from New Mexico State in the old days in what was called a police science degree, and went directly to Farmington, New Mexico. Became a patrolman, a detective, sergeant, SWAT team, etc. Did all that for 13 years, and then took a promotion to come run a organized crime unit and complex financial crimes for the Attorney General's office. And after a year of that, won a promotion to be the Deputy Director of the state's Law Enforcement Academy. And then the trucker cops, the motor trans, I was able to score my Chief of Police badge through those guys. They've got all the ports of entry, etc., and we had a 200-person department. Was ready to retire, and the governor won re-election and said, nah, you're sticking around. And for no good reason, he made me the Deputy Secretary of Taxation and Revenue. And the articulated reason was to help clean up Motor Vehicle Division because it was in a bit of disarray. And the rewrite of the tax computer programming, the trim systems was tremendously over budget and delayed, and kind of asked me to use the heel of my boot a little bit to bring some organization. And then a fellow named Rob Perry decided to run for Attorney General, had to leave government, and the governor made me the Cabinet Secretary for the Department of Corrections my last year. I've been retired 20 years now.
20 years. Now you play golf.
Yes, ma'am. Not well, but I'm a volume golfer.
What's going on with the police academy? What's going on with that?
I haven't talked to anybody over there in my 20 years. I took some retirement seriously, and I wish them nothing but the best.
You know, that was a great thing they did. And I don't know whether it's still in effect or not. I haven't heard anything about it. but they
It's
were
always been very professionally run,
wonderfully
and I
run.
was proud to be part of it.
Yes. I remember when I was working, I worked very closely with state police when I worked for the highway department. And all those men were trained out there. They were professional, no Mickey Mouse.
Well, the shortage of police officers has caused roughly 5 other than state police academies to go per year. And here lately, 2 academies for the state police alone. We've just got a lot of personnel to make up in the state. When I left state, federal, county, we had about 6,500 officers. That included the FBI, DEA, et cetera. And I think they want to get it up to somewhere near 9,000 now. And I know APD, which runs a satellite academy on behalf of the state, they're scrambling to beef up 150 more officers.
Right.
It's going to be a growth season for cops for a while.
Yeah. My heart's with them. It's a tough job. Okay, this relative of yours, Pete Burleson, what do you think he was? He was a sheriff, I know, but
I'll say he started off as a child at Tenement, an orphan. His father was 17. His mother was, he pokes me about this, she was a week away from her 14th birthday.
well, that's what they did back then.
And they were quite obviously ill-prepared to take care of a child.
Sure.
And they offed their child. He was born in a town 1 county over from where the parents lived in Mississippi. And given the circumstances and the habits of the time, would have been with maiden aunts. So she's there the latter part of her pregnancy, and her name was Luvacy Walters. And Pete's father was Nathaniel Marion Burleson. And after the birth, we are uncertain. We don't have documentation to support it, but for the first 3 years, he's not mentioned. And then when the 3 years cycle, he is no longer in either families, the Walters or the Burlesons household. And they had many, many relatives who had tapered off of cotton and wound up going to Texas as freighters to help support Native American populations that were centralized, and cavalry posts, and for all manner of business people. They were freighting goods out west into East Texas and a little further in. And we surmise that that's how he was taken in by a Burleson household.
Okay.
As a young boy, lived in Texas. Later on in stories, obituaries, etc., it identifies that he spent most of his early youth in Texas, and that officially we lose track of Pete by document until a historian from England wants to go learn about the West, finds a Pete who has to go catch some horse thieves, and that's where we pick up documentation.
That's where you got the documentation. And you have a lot of it. You went through, as I was going through this, I noticed you had newspaper clippings, you had city documents, state documents. So how long did it take you to do this book? And why in the world did you do it? There's so much in it.
Again, it goes back to we had gotten just a taste of the genealogical work 12 years ago, and then got refreshed into it about 2.5 years ago, and part through the family association and just researching other people, we came across the name, and with the encouragement of family association research group and the leadership encouraged us to pursue a book. Great idea, great character, just a very difficult time to write a book because it was right at COVID time period.
Right.
So we were We also had the option, we, again, being relatively new to the genealogical world, have become very accustomed to, well, tradition says, or, you know, my great-great-grandmother said this. We really wanted, because of the historian and me, we wanted to separate a lot of the hearsay and wanted, if there was hearsay, we included it and noted it in the book, but that's why you see an overabundance of references. We did seek out everybody who would make themselves available or documents available during the COVID time period.
Okay.
These friends that we made along the way helped contribute towards, in this 200-page book, there's 400 source documents. We were very enthusiastic about getting it right. And in that building up of collaboration, we came across historians, county clerks, critics of other works, editors of papers. I'll tell you truthfully, in the last month, I've received 3 more documents out of these county clerks. Karen Mills is a tremendous asset down in Lincoln County.
Mm-hmm.
And we got, as late as yesterday, a subpoena for Pete to show up for grand jury. And that's just typical of some of the support we've received,
Right.
the friends we've made, and everyone recognized the difficulties of COVID.
I think that, I'm sorry, that was also, I think, a part of the allure for us doing this is, rather than a straight biography, we had the hook for us. It had the genealogical tendencies to it. And I think a lot of the people we worked with, especially a lot of the county clerks that we corresponded with, it wasn't a traditional genealogical search. It was related to historical facts particular to their county, and we were tying an individual who was very involved in those events, so they got enthusiastic about it as well. So yeah, we got a tremendous amount of help.
Well, Pete was born, supposedly, and it's pretty definite now, 1848 in Kemper County, Mississippi. Now, he has gone down through Bandera, Texas, Arizona, Erath County, is that how you pronounce it? Texas, Cimarron, Colfax County here in New Mexico. Let's see, it just keeps going down here. He spent most of his life in the Cimarron area, Colfax. He was sheriff of all the way from Cimarron all the way up to Trinidad at one point, wasn't he?
The geographic idiosyncrasies of the politics of the time.
Right.
It was a much larger area and has since been compressed.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know what to call him. He was, number one, a cowboy. He was a cattle driver. He was branded an outlaw. He got along with all these guys. I guess you had to if you were the sheriff.
Pete's best friends were Clay Allison, a notorious outlaw, shootist. I think he was the first person ever identified in the Wild West as a shootist.
That's right.
And his other best buddy was young Davy Crockett, who was the grandnephew of Alamo Davy.
That's right.
And young Davy was a thug. He was a delinquent in every manner. Clay was a probative, educated Western gentleman who suffered the loss of a father when he was a young boy. They were poor. He wound up entering the Civil War and was drummed out because he's crazy. Been hit in the head too often, had a hair-trigger temper, and they drummed him out of a hard-pressed for manpower organization like the Confederacy because he's nuts. Well, he after sitting out for a while, rejoined in another county and came under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who we all know was the strategist for General E. Lee, and organized and founded the KKK.
That's right.
So Clay was fairly nefarious, but through cattle drives, how young Davy and Clay, and Pete all learn as young fellows how to get along, how to cover each other's back. That habit stayed with them till they all died.
Till they all died, yeah. Interesting.
So, good, bad, or indifferent, they had each other's backs.
Now, Clay killed more people probably than any Western.
Well, the figure we use when we tout the book is Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, Lincoln County War, the same time period as the Santa Fe Ring is going nuts through Reconstruction and the abuse and the corruption. Lincoln County, in the Lincoln County War, 19 people were killed.
Yeah.
Same time period, Colfax County, Pete Burleson, Clay Allison, 200 people died.
200.
And
Wow.
that's part of the impetus for why this story has to get out. How does no one know? All of these major Western events, driving the spike in the railroad that connects New Mexico and Colorado, Pete's there. Staving off Indian attacks in the town of Cimarron and Springer, Pete Burleson is there. And it's amazing feats that he does, stuff that's made for movies. And we got a lot of our information out of a Las Vegas Gazette about Pete's exploits. And it's just so darn sexy. How can you push it away and not look at it?
Right, right. Well, he was an interesting character, but he also got involved very strong in the political arena with the Santa Fe Ring and the rest of the...
Strange Bedfellows, again, I think going back to, Pete comes from Erath County. He's made acquaintances with Davy and with Clay Allison. There were a number of people that came on that Coleman Lacey cattle drive that he endeared forever. I think that's one of the characters we were talking in previous to this about Eugene Manlove Rhodes and how he described some of his favorite characters and loyalty, and it was loyalty to a fault. So when many of these cowboys came from Texas into New Mexico and became essentially squatters, it put them on the opposite side of the ring and the opposite side of many of the elected officials. And Pete went with that blind loyalty with all of his friends that put him against the political machine and steadfastly through it all, even with Davy Crockett, as crazy as he was and dangerous he was. I mean, Pete's the one who stood by him, collected the body, make sure he was taken care of. Clay Allison, Pete stood by him. Some of the things you were talking about as an outlaw, Pete had been accused by political officials of turning a blind eye, especially judges, about turning a blind eye of bringing Clay Allison in for arrest, and he just was not going to do that with Clay or Clay's brother John. And it's one of the characteristics I think you'll see throughout Pete's life is this, not always logical, but an unyielding loyalty to his friends.
Loyalty to friends, right.
Pete had run as an independent right in the middle of Reconstruction, the ring flexing its muscles. And Dave will tell you that it wasn't a Republican versus Democrat and why my newspaper's more powerful than yours. This is an independent, anti-ring person winning an election. Now, his father-in-law had been a previous sheriff there. When Pete comes up with Davy and Clay's brother, it's at the end of a cattle drive. They've dropped off cattle at different spots, and when he gets to New Mexico, they sort of decided this is our place. And the anti-ring folks, which included his father-in-law, who was Orson Kelsey Chittenden, he had been drummed out by the ring because he wouldn't go along and play. Well, he went to Clay Allison and said, can you get me somebody that will run? It can't be you, because you're too notorious of a criminal. And they come up with, what about Pete? And Pete likes his little 200 cattle ranch and just is enjoying life. And Clay invites him over to Orson Kelsey Chittenden's house, and they're trying to seduce him into becoming sheriff. and he's not having any of it. A couple months go by, and they bring him back over for one more try. And Orson Kelsey Chittenden offers the sweetener of, have you met my 15-year-old daughter? And that is Mary Eunicia Chittenden.
Yeah.
And she just thinks he's pretty. And they hold off till she turned 16, and they married for a lifelong marriage.
Yeah.
But once that sweetener came about, Pete turned around and decided to run.
Interesting. That's interesting. Back at that time, the Santa Fe ring is, I mean, I know a lot of people that are not enthralled by the Santa Fe ring. Their property was taken away from them. Here these guys they get into the land grants, these were grants that were given by the King of Spain to different people in New Mexico. These guys come in and they say, hey, let's get this all off of you, 5 cents an acre, $10 an acre, whatever it was. Do you feel that they were taken, the people of New Mexico?
That's a tough one.
Well, it happens, you know.
It does, and I mean, a large part of the confusion existed because of the federal government in the back and forth between the Department of Interior and other agencies is that's going to be public use land. No, it's not. It's private land, and back and forth. And people settle in the meantime thinking that, yes, this is open range for me. Some went through the process of actually working through Maxwell when he still owned the land to get leases or, to buy the land from him. But that confusion comes about, and I guess it's how a matter of you handle it. And that's where I think the ring, whether you subscribe they existed or didn't exist, that's where their really negativity comes in, is the fact that how they double dealt land, titles, the legal process they put many of the early residents through that was onerous, was costly, and yes, essentially swindled the land from many of these people.
Yeah. The Treaty of Hidalgo happened in 1848.
Right.
That ended the Mexican-American War, and that's when the land grants were challenged. How did that, Governor Armijo was involved in that somehow here in New Mexico. He obviously owned property or had some land grants given to him, and many of them were challenged at that point. How come nobody in the ring ever got shot?
Gunslingers. One of the major sells of the time is an English company came in and got a bunch of that Maxwell land. And
Huge.
Hops is bigger than some states.
Right.
And hop, skip, and a jump, they resold it to an Amsterdam group who had been sitting on money through Spain fights England, England fights France. They financed it all and sat on a ton of cash, and they decided they would take their cash and basically come buy up the northern third of New Mexico. Well, that lag period from them showing up to occupy the land, squatters, double, sometimes triple deeding the land occurred by these ring officials, and they were able to get away with it because they saw to the appointment of all of the judges, all of the district attorneys, and established most of the newspapers. So they had good ground cover for all of their activities. And if you challenged it, our judges will take care of it. And for those instances, for the very hard-headed, they began in Lincoln County and in Colfax County bringing in the gunslingers. And the gunslingers would change allegiances.
That's right.
That caused a bunch of the bloodiness. And they also utilized gangs coming in at night to come tear down. Yeah, oh yes. Los Gorros Blancos was one of the most
I never even
notorious.
heard of those gangs.
Well, Los Gorros Blancos was headquartered in Las Vegas, traveled up north to terrorize people's homes, to run their cattle off, to cut their fences, and in some cases just out and out shoot people if you wouldn't give up. And so there became this bidding war over gunslingers. Clay Allison was one who originally started with the ring people and just decided he didn't like that. He and Pete, by this time, had endeared themselves to the Hispanics of Colfax all the way over to Taos. They become heroes, and they rather enjoyed that role.
What about the Buffalo Soldiers? Now that when the Civil War was going on, we used the Buffalo Soldiers. A lot of the blacks went in to fight for the North. Well, when the war was over, then they took out and they came to the Southwest, which is pretty smart on their part. But they weren't treated so well either.
Not at all. And I mean, the dynamics of it as well. We know many of these Texans and cowboys that came into New Mexico were, if not former Confederate soldiers, were Confederate sympathizers. And then they come in, and the soldiers that were originally stationed in the northern New Mexico territories, not a lot of issues, but then there was a wholesale essentially change, restationing of troops, and that's when the Buffalo Soldiers came in. So all of those, prejudices that came, it did not take much to bring those out.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting at the top of this critical point, Clay Allison, a apostle of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who made very clear his hatred for blacks. And at some point, a number of the citizens complained about the violence in Colfax County to the governor. And Frank Springer, by theft, discovers a letter that describes to the commandant of Fort Union, where these Buffalo Soldiers are at, they all want me to come down and address their problems of the violence. And the commandant is told, show up with a bunch of soldiers at the stagecoach station. I'm going to send a Saturday morning stage where they believe I'm going to be on it. If any of these people who showed up that were complainers of the violence, and if they flinch in any degree, especially if Clay Allison's there, kill them all. An investigator for the federal government found out about this letter from Frank Springer and decided it was undoubtedly a murder plot. Reports it to the uppers, Bureau of Interior, and they removed the governor and sent him away into exile for a year, but he came back as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because the ring still had clout. But the trouble with the Buffalo Soldiers were many. They had been heroic in every fashion in the Civil War, in the cavalry. They continue their heroism, and they're forming little communities. Blackton down in Roswell. We had a similar setup in outside of Cimarron, and they lived peaceably, became farmers. But at Fort Union, they were treated miserably. They wound up digging ditches and doing all of the things they had to do as slaves, but now they're doing it in a cavalry uniform. Well, they complained, and at some point it just phased out pretty much all of Fort Union. Mm-hmm. And it's a lovely facility. It's ruins, but it's really staffed well. And they have half of their rangers are qualified as historians. And they are a wealth of information and could not have been more helpful to us in helping to solve some of the problems with hangings, problems with why AWOL had been left to be so rampant. These same good soldiers were treated as ornaments, brought into Santa Fe to play band.
Right.
That was the limit.
I've seen those
they
pictures.
had ceremonial function at best.
Yeah.
They just weren't treated well at all.
Yeah. There was an Anglo domination in that area at that time. They didn't understand the culture of the Hispanics. They didn't understand the culture of the Native Americans. So I can see I don't know how they got through it. I mean, it must have been rough.
And the soldiers were bored to tears. And what do bored soldiers, white or black, do? They look for mischief. And just outside of the fort, along the Mora River, a little cottage, a tent cottage, developed where it was full of prostitutes and gambling houses and all sorts of mischief causing that could happen. And the church chat ladies of Santa Fe at the time took great offense that this was taking place and demanded that the governor take that away. And there was a series of articles written in the Santa Fe New Mexican, and they called the series Sodom on the Mora.
I didn't know that.
It's a pretty terrific story. I've been to the area, and it's a gorgeous little glade and nice little fishing hole. But at the time, there was no fishing.
A lot of different fishing.
Yeah.
I would just also add to that, in addition to how poorly they were treated, this is not something that was restricted to just the ring or just to Pete and his friends. For example, Davy Crockett shooting 3 of the blacks and not being punished legally through the system. Clay Allison had killed black soldiers, again, not punished.
Not punished.
Some of the Hispanic leaders in Cimarron had killed black soldiers, not been punished.
Yeah.
And so the legal system did not afford any additional justice or privilege for the soldiers there. So they really did spend their leisure time at the risk of their own life.
Right. Well, that was an interesting section in here. I found it fascinating.
Many of these killings took place at the St. James Hotel.
I was going to ask you that.
And
there are bullet holes all over that place.
There are, and I asked for an explanation from staff about the Buffalo Soldiers and several of the other murders, and they delivered to me a list of 26 murders that had occurred there. And they had names attached to it, and I took that list back on a secondary visit to the Fort Union historians, and they said, there's 2 names missing. I said, well, give me, what do you got? And they gave me 2 ladies' names who had been soiled doves, prostitutes. And again, I went back to the St. James, and can you explain these 2 names being missing? Oh, those are whores. Whores don't count.
Oh, yeah.
That's a quote that's going in one of our next works. But it's just attitudinal issues, total indifference. If you're not part of the cowboy gang and you're not part of the mining gang, you're not anything.
It kind of resembles today a little bit.
Things die slow, especially in New Mexico.
It does. It really does. Now, Pete's first hanging was a black man.
Named Breckenridge, who was an AWOL soldier.
Who was from Trinidad.
He had a wife in Trinidad and was holed up with her for better than a year. Breckenridge did an out-and-out robbery on a farmer named Maxwell and killed him and his son. I think maybe 12 years old-ish in that area. And then took off, and they all know who did it. And he sat in Trinidad for better part of a year, and newly elected Pete was tasked to go right the wrong. Well, he went out there and got Breckenridge and brought him back and had him adjudicated properly. And Pete oversaw the first legal hanging in New Mexico territory.
But the kid admitted that he had. He actually admitted that he had killed.
It was a hanging on the scaffold confession, and he did say that he did it. It was over $38. Just silliness.
I think the other thing to note there too, when we were talking, going back to the treatment of the blacks, that the mob, 400 odd people showed up for this hanging. And the mob, though, did not want to wait. They wanted to take matters in their own hand. And I think it's part of the, I don't want to come out and say altruistically Pete was this humanitarian and had an affinity toward the blacks at the time, but they insisted on the justice force, and he quelled, it was the respect the crowd had for him as well, as he was able to quell them and go through the official process rather than allowing a typical New Mexico lynching.
Yeah.
Two surgeons showed up for Breckenridge's hanging, and that was in response to several botched hangings. You may recall the Blackjack Ketchum.
Oh,
hanging,
yeah, that was horrible.
Where his own cohorts turned him in for the reward. $500 was just too darn appealing. Well, he's caught, he's tried, and he's brought to justice, and the hanging is supposed to take place. And they botched it, and when they dropped him, his head popped off.
Right.
So there was this hue and outcry to start doing hangings in a better fashion. So now we have surgeons show. Well, one of the surgeons was a officer from Fort Union named Tipton. And we found out through our own genealogical ways, Tipton had married into this greater family. And Tipton took possession of Breckenridge's body, didn't have him buried, did not have him brought back to Fort Union, took him home and started dissecting him without permission.
Okay.
And that was a showstopper for these historians who told me, that's not in our files. You're going to have to go to the equivalent of Library of Congress for Department of Defense for those records.
Well, you were talking about Blackjack Ketchum losing his head. He was a big man. He was shot and brought to Mount San Rafael Hospital in Trinidad, where he was arrested and brought down and hanged in Cimarron.
And he had a penchant for railroads and stagecoaches.
Yeah,
that was pretty much his forte.
And he was a big killer too.
He was, and one of the more interesting contributors we had was the county clerk for Colfax and Raton, was the great-great-granddaughter of the sheriff who did the hanging for Blackjack Ketchum.
I'll be darned.
So it's just interesting how everybody has an attachment to every little story that we ferreted out. Someone knew something. Someone was connected, related, and that enriched the whole process for me.
Besides Pete, who was the main character in this book, who was the person that you found most interesting? And same question for you.
Wow, that's a tough one. I guess right off the top of my head, I would say it was his wife, Mary. I mean, she had all of those rich historical events happen to her as well. She traveled the Santa Fe Trail. You know, Pete came up through the cattle drives, but she actually went through as a young child, survived the trail, set up being chased by natives on her way to school.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact that everything you see in the book that Pete went through, well, Mary went through that equally. Having her husband come home with another bullet in him, and then the time she's trying to raise children at the same time, losing her first daughter, and then making these journeys with Pete throughout New Mexico, and only for him to settle in Lincoln County, where he was again putting his life at risk on a regular basis, being the deputy 5 times. So Mary had an incredible story, and fortunately, with the Federal Writers Project during the 30s, she was interviewed, and in 5 different sessions, her story was captured.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And that brings me to my favorite character,
Okay.
who had a minor role in all this. The federal writer assigned to come down was a lady named Edith Crawford. Now, this is mid-Depression. Everybody needs a job. They were giving artists jobs with WPA. There was a writers project within WPA, and they were assigned large amounts of money to help get stories out and write everything about America you could find. And the group she was with in New York sort of looked down the hall, Edith, come down here. We want to send you out to New Mexico, to the Lincoln County area, because we still think it's fresh enough. There's a lot of interest in Billy the Kid. Well, she got down here to New Mexico and decided, I'm going to turn this story. I want to do the women pioneers, the wives of all of these people. And she must have interviewed a dozen families that had been, women who had been around during Billy the Kid and these rampages of running farmers off. And she took down their stories and just how violent it was. And everyone, the deputies in particular, go, well, you surely want to interview the sheriff. And she says, yeah, let's go see the sheriff. And go, the sheriff's dead. The man they called the sheriff was Pete. He had that honor and respect that he had served 5 times as a deputy, and he had been the sheriff for 2 terms in Colfax. And even down there, they just all adored Pete and said, we're going to go see his widow, Mary Eunicia Chittenden, to tell that story. Now, she's a tough-minded, Northeast educated reporter, writer, who's being tasked to come way out west, who had originally docketed her time at 4 months in New Mexico. She stayed 4 years.
I'll be darned. Interesting.
And I find her to be a really interesting character, that you displace this hard-edged, fairly typical Yankee woman to come out to the West and talk to these tough Anglo and Hispanic women about their experiences.
Yeah.
I found that to be very touching. And the little pieces she drew out, she talks to Mary about moving to the Mora area as a child, and that the vivid memory she had of her mother, Mary Searcy Chittenden, coming into a ramshackle cabin with dirt floors. And she had been an educated, well-bred Easterner, and she cried at seeing a dirt floor. And just that memory that she was able to bring out, I thought was very gifted as a writer. She talked about how meticulous her father, leaving Westport, Missouri, which is now Kansas City, that was the staging point for all of the covered wagons to head west.
Yeah.
She talks about how carefully her father had packed the wagon, because you were going to have to cross rivers, and they didn't always make it, and you had to watch your weight, watch your balance. But she noted that her father had packed candle molds. And that's such an innocuous little feature. But the candle molds made it to Mora. They were able to take beef tallow and make wax out of it. And no one else out of 100 wagons had thought to bring candle molds. I mean, figure in 1800s how valuable that was. He was able to barter people coming over to borrow his candle molds for a week at a time for cattle, pigs, chickens, just how shrewd that was. And that minute detail stuck in the mind, and that this reporter was able to elicit that.
Well, to make that trip had to be a hardship that wouldn't quit. They had the Native Americans, these different tribes, Pueblo tribes, the Comanches, the Apaches, attacking constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And because they didn't want them on their land, and I don't blame them. You know? So it's been it was a constant fight going on. They captured the women, they captured the children, and it had to be, how many bodies are buried on that trail?
Sure. The forts were crucial in giving intelligence. All along the stops, you'd stop at a fort, resupply, give supplies to the soldiers, and then you would get intelligence. Where's the next river crossing? Where's a good watering place for the cattle?
Yeah.
What's the Indian attacks look like? And they were very careful to avoid that. And the company that had the concession on the cattle drives were run by Tom Boggs, who has a museum in Taos, and his partner, Kit Carson.
That's right.
They were very famous for nursing these wagon trains from east to west, and they had set up concessions along the way in between these stops, where they would take off their chaps and their cowboy hats and their vests, and they would put on aprons, and now they were storekeepers, resupplying the trains.
A lot of, well, you figure out all the merchants that came through. Las Vegas had the highest group of Jewish merchants were in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And that would,
They were all carryovers from the Jewish Exodus people from the Inquisition, way back when.
right.
Spanish Jews came over
Yeah.
in that time frame, and they were centered. You stopped at Albuquerque to buy and sell horses and to gather apples. That was a big deal.
Apples, that's in here. There's a
That's
big,
another piece of our story. But then these conquistadors, particularly after the revolt, and I have the Spanish conquest too, the headquarters was Abiquiu. And you will find still today a very high concentration of Spanish Jews
yes.
there. And the merchants that you're talking about in Las Vegas stem from roots that they developed in Abiquiu.
I noticed on your biography back here, Jim, you're holding the gun that won the West. What is that?
That's your Winchester 1873.
Okay.
That's a big deal. And it shot the same round as their pistols were, 44-40. So you could carry one belt of ammo. It would service both guns, and it was a repeating rifle. And I got that gun here locally, and I'm just proud as punch about it.
Sure, it's
But
a real collection.
It's the same rifle that Pete eventually used.
Yeah. What about this gun here? It's a double action 44 caliber.
The pistol?
This is the one that was used in the killing of Tom Driscoll.
Yeah. You want to go?
Tell me about it. Looks like a big gun.
It was a very useful, very popular new weapon for Westerners, especially lawmen, and powerful enough to usually take you down in one round. Well, Pete showed up at a gambling hall. We talk about some of Pete's mischief. He liked gambling. He eventually wound up running 2 gambling halls in White Oaks. But he showed up at Step Saloon in Springer, and in a poker game, he came across several fellas that he knew, and this stranger, Tom Driscoll, who had been a cattle boss for the Palo Pinto Cattle Group out of Texas. And Driscoll met Pete out on the street and said, "Are you Pete Burleson?" "Yes, I am." "You got any relatives in Texas?" "Yes." And that turned out to be a big clue, DNA-wise for us, because we traced down that man's family, living relatives, and we were able to positively identify what family group Pete came from. But this Tom Driscoll said, "Well, your Texas Burlesons are all sons of bitches, and you are too." And Pete kind of gave him the, go away, don't bother me. A couple days later, they wound up in a poker hall, Step Saloon, and Driscoll's not faring very well at the table, and he just gets mad, decides to go for his gun, and his gun gets grabbed. At the same time, Pete's quicker and shoots him in the groin.
Ooh.
And he's bleeding out. And they haul Tom to a hotel, and he's laying there bleeding out. They don't really have much in the way of medical attention. And he confesses, "I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Pete was right to do what he did." And everybody hears it. Well, he dies. And all of the witnesses go to the judge and tell the judge this was self-defense, and the judge just said, "I'll be here for my next rounds and we'll find him not guilty for reasons of self-defense." Pete comes right away to the judge and said, "You're going to hear this. I did that. Here's why I did that." He's very forthright about it. But what would attract people with tough tempers who know they're going to be surrounded with people that are like them to go where there's drinking and guns at the table? You just think about that mindset. There's wild and then there's wild.
Mm-hmm.
But Pete was never tried on that.
Interesting, again, the politics of the day, because with the Santa Fe papers controlled by the Ring,
Right.
if you look, when we were doing the research, if you look at the articles, the local articles were much more expansive, and they explained all of the details and the fact that Pete had reported he had been released. The Santa Fe papers would produce a one paragraph that
Right.
said that Pete had murdered Driscoll and that he had left the scene, essentially.
And been arrested.
Yeah.
And
They
that
stopped.
he had been arrested, and they would stop there. The other interesting piece of this, and again, it kind of goes back to the thing of the whole part of the book of how did this character not get captured by some author some point of the way, but this incident with Driscoll not only carried statewide, it was carried regionally, it was carried back east, and we even found a copy of the Driscoll shooting in a newspaper in Australia.
I'll be darned.
So Pete's exploits were known, but nowhere since cumulatively have they been pulled together to look.
So you've got a lot more work to do on this man.
There's still a lot of work. His early years, clearly. Some of the things that we've written down, we're getting ready to go do a presentation with the Family Association again in the research group. But his early youth, we're coming up with a lot more details of Burleson's in proximity to where Pete was during his youth. That's clearly one we need to pursue. Some of the family issues. The newspapers back then were very good about, hey, Uncle Joe came to see
Oh,
his
yeah.
dad, and spent 2 days. Well, we found a lot of that, so there was a lot of that interaction. But we'd like to find out a lot more about the relationship of Pete and his kids. Not really a word mentioned about his oldest daughter Clara and dying of diphtheria in the epidemic in Mora. Like to find out more about that. For me, particularly, one of the missing pieces, we would like to really solidify more the connection between Clay Allison and Pete. I really think there's a much closer, a longer relationship that goes back into Texas, but Jim alluded to the Saturday coach assassination attempt. Pete was thick with Clay, with McMains, with those anti-grant or anti-ring groups, and that letter is a piece of documentation we've not been able to put our hands on. 12 to 14 citizens invited the governor to come down. Governor never responded to the letter, but that's where the letter that was discovered by Springer, given to Frank Angel, the investigator. We know there were 12 to 14 people, and they always list the same 4 names, but we'd like to really know, going through the archives, going through the records that we have even for Axtell's files, we haven't found it. And I'd like to really know that Pete was that close that he was considered a threat to the ring.
And they probably disappeared like all the records did on Cricket Cougar.
I'd like to take a quick time out, if you'll permit me, that Mora and Springer and Cimarron bring close to mind the fires that our state's going through.
Absolutely.
My oldest son is running a bulldozer in and around the circumference of the hemisphere to clear a path for firefighters to get there. And I'm really concerned for our state. And
Absolutely.
I'd like to encourage anybody that has any way of helping the victims of these fires to come forward.
Yes, there are people right now here in Santa Fe taking up collections, and I think that's a good idea. There are people that, they need everything, just the basics, toilet paper, anything that you can get together for these people. 6,000 were evacuated out of Vegas, and over there in your favorite part of the country there, the St. James Hotel, that could be in jeopardy too.
They've evacuated a couple of times already.
Yes.
And one of our dear friends, Jerry, who was a hotel, was a bank, was a bar there in Springer. He renovated it and turned it into a condo space upstairs and restored the bar underneath it.
Yeah.
He's talking about perhaps losing his home. It's a tough, tough problem.
I hope they don't lose all that,
Yeah.
because that's history right there. I was over at the St. James, a few years ago, and I stayed in the Jesse James room.
Yeah.
And they kept telling me that they do have a room that's closed off.
That's the J.T. Wright.
That's right. And they
He
say
had won in a poker game, the hotel,
Mhm.
from Henri Lambert,
Yeah,
and his room was directly across from the upstairs high-stakes room. And right after he won, he walked across the hall to his room and was shot in the back by Henry Lambert. And Henry got to keep his hotel.
yeah.
And in revenge, TJ haunts them.
Oh, yeah.
The
they
staff
say-
are thoroughly convinced.
That's what I
They've
heard.
locked up with a padlock the room, and as I'm hearing the story, and I'm tactile as hell, I grab the lock, and right away the woman who was giving me the tour gasps, "Oh, why did you do that?" And I go, "What? You shouldn't jiggle that lock, because every time that happens, somebody on the staff gets a sighting and scares the bejesus out of them." I didn't know.
Oh, yeah, they say it's really happens over there. And I was talking to somebody, and they said at one point Jesse James had bought property over there in that area. Well, where could you find a better hideout than in Cimarron back in the 1800s? Nobody even knew about it.
The hotel was like the Studio 54 of its time. It was just where anybody involved in gunfights had to go.
Yeah,
It was a popular place to be. And the young lady who was my guide was a public relations lady at the hotel. Turns out she was the great-great-granddaughter of Frank James. And Frank had never stayed at the hotel, but Jesse did a good 4 times. And they showed me the logs of
yeah,
where he had checked in, and he always used the same alias. But the staff at the time would say, "Jesse, what can we do for you?" And he
Yeah.
always responded.
yeah.
It was a wink and a nod.
You know, I was looking at the costs here. There says here, the Kearney Code of 1846. It was a fee system for sheriffs and other lawmen in the New Mexico Territory. I couldn't believe they got .05 cents per mile, .05 for calling each witness, support of prisoners daily, 25 cents, summoning jurors. I didn't even think they had jurors back then, but only men, no women, because women might make a different decision.
Well, they couldn't vote.
I know they couldn't vote yet. That brings up another situation. That was 50 cents. Summoning witnesses was 50 cents. Service of a warrant was $1. Commitment of prisoners to jail, $1. Levying executions, civil, $1. Attending court daily, $1.50. Summoning a grand jury, $5. And executing a death warrant, $15. Not very much money. Even back then, it wasn't very much.
Well, compared to their salaries,
Yeah.
it was a nice little attractive feature because
Yeah.
they didn't pay you squat.
Right.
But for these miscellaneous duties, you could catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Where the majority of their income really came from was from collecting fees on licenses and taxes, and they would get a percentage of that.
They would get percentages.
And that's where these sheriffs in these huge counties, traveling all the time, that's where the bulk of their income came from.
Now, the movies will tell you they made a ton of money off of arrests. And there was some money to be made, and business was good.
What about this new Billy the Kid movie?
Well, the one that came out recently on Old Henry is a version where Billy lives, has a wife, has a son, moves to Oklahoma. It's very well done with Tim Blake Nelson as the star. The series on Stars or Epics, I'm not sure which one. It's out now, and there's 3 already canned. And then there's another movie I think comes out later this month. Now, Dave will tell you about Billy had a good press agent.
That's one of the things that's resounding about Pete. How come nobody knows about Pete? How come nobody knows about Clay Allison? How come nobody knows about the Colfax County Wars? If you look at it from the Lincoln County Wars, Jim's already told you the numbers would dictate a lot more attention. Within a year or two of Billy dying, the first dime novel came out, and then they continued to pour out. Starting in 1911, the first Billy the Kid movie came out. There's been a Billy the Kid movie every decade
That's
since
right.
1911, all the way until now, 2022. You have Lash LaRue and Roy Rogers and Paul Newman and Chris Christopherson and all of these actors playing this role. I mean, it's no wonder that the media has perpetuated Billy the Kid, the myth, the legend, the real person, but it just completely overshadows the activities that were taking place in the North.
When we went on separate visits to Lincoln to interview people, they were writing a whole Wild West book, and you could see their breath relax and their shoulders relax when we said, but we're not here to talk about Billy the Kid. It's
Yeah.
like, whew. And we talk about Pete, and some people knew stories here and there, but they were so inundated with Billy the Kid stuff. And they kind of led us to believe their feeling is the Billy the Kid people have taken on the kookiness of UFO people.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody's got a theory. Did he live? Did he not? Was his killing real? And we're here to talk about a real live person and real live events, and you can see them perking up. And that's how we've really been able to get a lot of participation. It's just the sheer relief of we're talking about true history.
Oh, you've got it all documented, and it's a marvelous book. How, if somebody wants to get this book, how do you get it? Do you have it in the stores, or how are you selling it?
It's through Amazon.
Through Amazon.
And the Kindle edition, is a hard copy. And if you just search under the title, it'll bring up the copies.
The Man Who Tamed Cimarron. Have you been selling a lot of copies?
I haven't checked the numbers lately. We bought our fair share ourselves, but within I don't know.
Last time I checked, it was in the 600s. So it's just propelling. And we've got to do a lot more outreach, and we're doing that.
We'll
I
put
will
this-
humbly say that the authors have not taken a penny. This goes, if you buy it off of Kindle, if you get it off of Amazon, it's a meager printing cost, and everything that's sold over and above that goes to benefit the Burleson Family Research Group. While we're at conferences, the conference at Burleson Family Association, they have bought a goodly supply of them, and they sell them at a discount at the conference.
Now tell me about this conference.
June 24, 25, 26, Burlesons from all over the country will come and do presentations, do exchange of information, and enjoy some fellowship. We're all cousins, and we'll have a great time. Now, the 3 days before that, our research committee, which Dave and I are on, and there's 5 other members, we're going to be at the Dolph Briscoe Library at the University of Texas, locations in Bastrop, Lampasas, which was originally named Burleson. We're going to go to sites there gathering historical documents while we were there. So it's a working visit cousins trip. And we'll have a load of fun. People from the North Carolina-based Burleson Family Research Group will be there as well. So there'll be a very thorough exchange of information.
In ending, I'd like to read this last paragraph you did. I thought it was quite interesting. Pete Burleson lived in an incredibly historic time. What is puzzling is how he was involved in so many historically significant events: Goodnight Loving Trail Drive, Colfax County War, and the entry of the Santa Fe Railroad into New Mexico territory, with so many historical significant individuals: Clay Allison, Davy Crockett, Johnny Ringo, George Curry, and members of the Santa Fe Ring, but does not have known any written work focused on him. This biographical sketch is a long overdue tribute to the life of Peter Burleson, a New Mexico pioneer and hero, a trouble man. That's exactly what it was. I want to thank both of you for showing up on our show today.
Thank you.
And we'll put this on YouTube, and I know you'll get a response, because I recommend it for historians to read this book. Takes a while to read.
Thanks, Carlene. Our wives are already doing battle over who should play Pete in the movie. There's going to be a movie.
I know who I would have selected in 1940, John Carradine.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of eye candy for women fellas that are on Yellowstone, and that's who they're leaning towards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. It's good. Well, I hope you do get a movie out of it. It's a wonderful book, and thank you for coming on today. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your historical knowledge on this.
Thanks, Carlene.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. And thank you, Santa Fe.